With you guys. So, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our final gathering in this semester's edition of the Healing Arts Encounters in Art and Medicine here at the Charité Berlin. My name is Lukas Feireis, and it has been a true privilege to host and co-curate this dialogue series across the past months here at the Charité. I start every time to ask who's here for the first time today. It's a few, good. And who has a medical background? And an artistic background? So today the artists are more than the medical practitioners in the room, but it changes every time. So this series began with a simple but profound question: what happens when we allow the arts and medicine to learn from one another? Not as opposites, but as co-practitioners of care. And over the course of our conversation, we've seen again and again how these two fields can be collaborators in healing, in knowledge production, and in reimagining how we relate to ourselves, each other's, and the systems we inhabit. Tonight marks not an end, but a kind of punctuation, an opportunity to reflect on what has emerged and what might yet unfold. And speaking of reflections, I will ask you again, Vanessa, to come, because for those of you that are students and are still needing credit points, after each session, you will send in your reflections. And this is quite a beautiful way to read the room, also kind of what stuck and what stayed with our guests. And Vanessa will read some of them out to you.
Thank you. So I would like to briefly return to some reflections from the last session last week. And we had Christine, a doctoral student in medical informatics, emphasizing how the lecture shifted her perspective from technological solutions to structural and social dimensions of health. She highlighted how discrimination in healthcare isn't just about access, but about trust, emotional safety, and the power of empathetic design to create inclusive spaces. Her key takeaway: we can't program away systematic injustice, but we can counter it through awareness, storytelling, and human-centered design. Julia reflected on the ethical responsibility of research. For her, Hannah Strohmeyer's question, "Who are we doing this research for?" was a wake-up call. She felt that this session invited a deeper examination of how we communicate knowledge and who benefits from it. The lecture became a space to ask hard questions about academic conventions and the courage it takes to propose new formats and the ethics of care. Last but not least, Natalie focused on co-building and participatory design as essential to re-establishing trust in health system. She noted that art, film, and culturally rooted care models don't just convey information, they make it felt. By working with communities rather than speaking for them, new forms of knowledge and action can emerge, ones that challenge conventional hierarchies and invite broader participation. They all remind us that healing happens in the space between knowledge, trust, and collaboration. So let's carry that into today's session and see where it takes us from there. Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Vanessa. So we are joined this evening by two exceptional thinkers and practitioners to the left and to the right of me, whose work inhabits the fertile terrain between science, performance, and artistic research. Dr. Michele Luchetti moves fluidly between academic inquiry and embodied practice. Trained as a philosopher of science and as a theater educator, his work engages the performative dimensions of knowledge and care. Michele's theater laboratories, often conducted in collaboration with social and health institutions, foreground the body, the encounter, and the collective act of meaning-making as tools of insight and transformation. Dr. Sasha Bergstrom-Katz is an artist and researcher whose practice-based projects delve into the aesthetics and politics of medical and scientific histories. With a background in psychosocial studies, correct? And fine art, her work investigates how objects, technologies, and performances have shaped human and medical sciences, offering alternative ways of understanding memory, embodiment, and perception. So together, Sasha and Michele bring distinct yet resonant perspectives to the question of how we create, share, and embody knowledge, particularly at the intersection of medicine, science, and art. Their work invites us to stay open to alternative methods of inquiry, to the role of performance in meaning-making, and to the potential of imagination and embodiment as serious tools for research and reflection. These questions resonate deeply with the very premise of the healing arts, that healing is not solely a matter of treatment, but of attention, of participation, and connection. As each time, we'll begin with a brief reflection from each of our guests, about 50 minutes each, followed by an open conversation, and as always, your thoughts and your questions. Thank you for being here, listening, for engaging, and for contributing to this evolving space. Let's begin.
So thank you very much, Lucas and Vanessa, and everyone to be here this evening and for organizing such a beautiful series of events. We'll break the format. So I will start with a very brief introduction of our shared framework of work. Sure. Thank you. And then Sasha will then jump in and present a little bit of our shared work and of her own work, and then I'll conclude. Thank you. So this is us, and this is sort of the a pictorial representation of the overarching idea that underlies our shared and individual research projects, research and practice-based projects, which is based on the fact that the critical humanities can enrich and diversify their perspectives on medicine and the human sciences, which is the sciences we mostly focus on, by looking at them through the lenses of the performing arts. In particular, we focus on how medical and scientific knowledge is produced, justified, and applied in specific contexts, and on how concepts and methods from the performing arts and theater can help us illuminate certain aspects that are underappreciated of these processes of knowledge making. So in this sense, our work is inspired by traditions that are already established in the humanities and that have applied performance and notions about performance as theoretical or experimental frameworks to investigate science and medicine. For example, the tradition of social action as performance with famous scholars like Erwin Goffman or Victor Turner, who have produced a lot of work on that was very helpful in discussing the performative aspects of medical practice. On the other hand, for instance, the tradition of reenacting historical experiments that is established in the history and philosophy of science. On the other hand, no. Well, thank you. I try again. Okay, perfect. Yes. So on the other hand, we think that also the performing arts can benefit from a stronger interactions with the history, philosophy, and sociology of science. Because, for example, there has been in recent times a lot of work being done on the relationship between performance and medicine by scholars in fields such as the medical humanities or performance studies. A lot of our artists, art practitioners have increased their attention towards topics that are related to medicine and have raised important questions about the nature of medical knowledge in connection especially with social and ethical issues that relate to how medical knowledge is produced and applied. A lot of similar questions are actually asked in the philosophy, history, and sociology of medicine. For instance, questions about the nature of health and illness, the role of patient experience in medical practice, or the impact of values in the production and application of medical knowledge. So there is a common area of questions that are asked by both the humanities scholars and our practitioners, but sometimes there's not much interaction. What we think is that a stronger interactions between these fields is always something good. And with that, I leave it to Sasha to continue this introduction.
Okay, so now I have to get used to it. Perfect. So the question, how are we going about doing this? So we have a few things in the works. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the practical kinds of activities we're doing. One is a collaborative, we both have collaborative projects together, as well as our individual research. So today we're going to spend most of our time talking about the individual projects, but I wanted to introduce two initiatives we've taken up together. Firstly, in the spring of 2024, we initiated a working group bringing together around 20 scholars and arts practitioners to share their in-progress work with in intimate online settings or sessions. The working group is made up of artists, arts and humanities scholars who use or study performance in relation to scientific and medical practices, past and present. Many of the interdisciplinary researchers like us work in both academic research and have artistic or performance practices. So for example, Lucy Strecker, whose collaborative work is pictured here in detail, is a performance artist and an artistic researcher who studied, for example, biotech, microbial agency and earthquakes through different performance methods. So she's someone who's part of our working group, and other scholars study a range from medical research and practice, psychotherapy, cognitive and neurological testing, science education and communication. Those are just a few of the sort of interests of the group. And to plug an event on the 15th of November, we're going to host a public event roughly from 5:30 to 7:30. I'll point out we don't yet have a website or press materials yet. So if you would like to be added to a mailing list about this, you can email me here. So this public event will include presentations of artistic and theater practices which relate to medical practice and scientific knowledge, and we'll be able to share some more information in the coming months. And then the other collaborative project that Michele and I have worked on together is that we've developed a course that shares its title with a working group, which is Performing Science and Medicine. And this course we've taught so far once at Bard College Berlin, and we're going to be offering it again in the upcoming spring. The class is structured around three central themes: the laboratory as a site of scientific experimentation and knowledge production, the clinic as a space of medical practice and patient interaction, and the public sphere where scientific and medical knowledge is communicated to broader audiences. The course combines seminar-style discussions, so with readings from history, philosophy, and social studies of science and medicine, with active, often performative exercises or experiments. that engage students in embodied learning. So for example, we examined how reenacting historical experiments can reveal gaps in even the most detailed records or instructions, and how theater has been used to address issues like vaccine hesitancy. And each week, students engage with artistic works, hands-on projects, and critical texts, all of which contributed to the development of their final projects for the class. And with the permission of two of our students who collaborated together, I thought I could share one work. So we're getting a little closer to the practical, like what we actually did. So the project pictured here, conceived and performed by Sasha Johansson and Nora Stone-Roig, stands as a compelling example of using performance to examine and critique practices of a medical field, here gynecology and obstetrics. In this performance, the audience was walked through a series of tasks. Stone-Roig, dressed as a doctor, placed us in the position of medical students, instructing us to wash our hands and to put on gloves and medical masks. So this picture on the right. We were led outside, and we were then ordered to perform various procedures on the puppet patient pictured here, concluding in IUD insertion. However, towering above us, Johansson, embodying the puppet patient, resisted these commands and made it impossible to complete them as required. At key moments, a disembodied recorded voice interrupted the scene. Spoken aloud, anonymized testimonies from individuals recounting their experiences with IUD insertion. They spoke their stories. The recordings revealed recurring themes of pain, misinformation, mistrust within clinical encounters. Designed as a proposed intervention into medical education, so they actually had the vision of potentially performing this outside of our classroom space, but with medical students. The performance called for increased empathy and deeper respect for patients, yet it was far from a straightforward critique. Rather, the piece illuminated the complex tensions between institutional authority, embodied experience, and the relationship between medicine and care. So briefly, what teaching this class taught us was how crucial it was not just to use performance as a metaphor, which is frequently done, but actually to do it together, to see it in action and to enact it ourselves. So that's kind of a quick recap on some of our activities together. Now I will move into talking a little bit about one of my own research works before passing over to Michele again. So as I mentioned earlier, or I guess I didn't, reading from my script, I was going to introduce myself, but Lucas did such a good job. But as was mentioned, I'm both an artist and a researcher. I earned an MFA in the US, and then before that maintained an artistic practice for several years alongside working in arts administration. So it was only recently in 2019 that I began a PhD and sort of entered the field of research in a field called Psychosocial Studies, which was a department at Birkbeck in London. So what I'm going to show you is some of the work from my PhD, which used a blend of practice-based, historical, and theoretical approaches to study a selection of intelligence test kits like the one pictured here. I was fascinated by the convergence of these tests' material and aesthetic qualities and their power or authority. Intelligence tests, if you haven't encountered them before, very briefly, they were created in the early 20th century to measure intelligence or IQ of both children and adults. Tests like this one can only be bought and administered by licensed professionals, usually psychologists, but depending on regional restrictions, sometimes other therapists and educators. So the project I did means to participate in ongoing critiques of testing. So there's already been a lot of literature from especially history of science, critiquing testing, including examining their embedded implicit biases, their social harms, and their genealogical ties to eugenics. As such, my project looks at how the materials themselves transport and transmit these attributes in history. So I was really curious about what the object itself brings forward about the history that's already sort of been told and unpacked. So a couple of the guiding questions for the project were, what theories of intelligence, ability, disability, and normality are built into the test kits themselves? And how do these test messages come through in the performance or the event of the test? So now we finally come back to performance. So for the project, I did a few different practice-based approaches, and I'm only sharing one here to study facets of the test kits, which I thought were already underexplored. So many scholars, as I said, have worked on their histories, efficacy, and fairness, but no one had looked at how the test kits themselves could communicate and how they could shape human interactions. So I took the test kit that you saw before sort of as the starting point. One especially compelling part of the tests to me was wondering about how they were performed. I wanted to see the test kits in action, so I invited 8 actors to come and rehearse the test kits with me, using the tests themselves as both scripts and props in the performance. We use the method of rehearsal because it highlights the decision-making processes, mistakes, and what it takes to achieve a good performance. So I'm going to show a clip in a second. So working with these 8 actors evidenced to the variability from person to person of what testing might look like. And I'm sort of telling you something obvious that you'll see in a moment. So I am going to show actually a sort of longer piece of the work. It's 7 minutes, and we'll end with some very brief concluding thoughts and then can open this up in the discussion. Oh, you do it. And the captions are auto-generated, so I'm sorry if anything is off from what's said.
So great to see you. I'm happy to be today. And yeah, as you know, we will ask some questions here in this test. So I start and you will answer. Okay? Great. I'll ask you to do a number of things. Solving some number problems or giving some way different. You might find some of them hard, others will easy. You might not be able to finish all the items. But I would still ask you to do that. Do you have a question? You will find some of these tasks a little bit difficult and some of them a little bit easier. But I want to say focus and always do your best. You understand?
You know, I'll be willing to test you. And you sort of know what it's about. I don't know if you've seen it before. But this is the part I'm going to be working on here. And working on this in front of me. And there's going to be also the questions. Really. And the thing is here, basically, you just do the best you can, everybody else does the best they can.
Which one is the prettier? Which one is the prettier?
I will ask you some questions today, and you'll get some fast. Some will be easy, and some will be more difficult. And also, most people don't answer every one of the questions, but please do your best. Do you have any questions? Good. Then we go right. I will do it again. Perhaps I should not say it today.
Of course. I'm going to say some numbers. Please listen carefully. And when I'm through, say them right after me. Okay? You ready? 5, 8, 2.
So now I'm going to show you some pictures. In each picture, there's a part missing. I want you to look at each picture carefully and tell me what is missing. Now, what's missing in this picture? And on this one. And no, the flap is missing.
Okay. Gonna hide the pivot now. And I'm gonna see if you can find it. Okay?
Okay, now we're going to do something different. In this next section, I want you to tell me the meaning of words. Now listen carefully and tell me what each word will say meaning. Are you ready? Can you tell me the meaning of designate? House.
Behind it. There's a glass of water over there, or you know, yeah. We're gonna do this test today. And I think you'll like it. There's a whole lot of questions, but some of them will find easy, some of them you won't. Everyone finds some of them easy, everyone, some of them hard. But I think you'll find it interesting. How do you get here? Exactly. What do you call this one? Yeah. What should you do if you see a train approaching, a broken train? Yeah? Why is it better to give a house of brick than a house of wood? House of wood, yeah. Why is Plymouth not that? I'm gonna ask the previous question again, obviously it's wood. Why is it better to do that? Make more sense and Plymouth is Plymouth is in house of wood. Why is it better? Why is it better to build a house of brick than a wood? Yeah, a house of brick and a house of wood. Yeah. Why are criminals not done?
So this is an excerpt. This is an excerpt of a research video I did. Oh, that's fine. It can actually go to the next anyway. Which has a longer format, but this actually shows you a lot of what happened in the rehearsal space. Sorry for the captions, they went a bit haywire, but did the opposite of what they were supposed to do. So I just thought I'd lend some quick remarks on this before I pass over to Michele. So to be clear, the actors didn't have psychological training or training in test administration. So this is really an artistic reenactment and not true to the actual testing situation. But the project meant to tie a few things together. It looked at the ways in which the performance script or test manual seeks to perform uniformity in practice from examiner to examiner and wonders what constitutes a uniform enough performance. What is it that makes testing fair? Is it uniformity or is it sensitivity to each test subject? And how is this balance managed? So the test itself calls for something called good rapport, so that the test subject is comfortable. And I sort of wondered throughout this, how can this be taught and standardized? And secondly, I came to ask, how can the test be evaluated as a form of theater? Or can the test be evaluated as a form of theater? If so, beyond the assessment of intelligence, what does the performance communicate about the field of psychology and its relationship to science and healing? For me, it positions the psychologists in an unusual space, somewhere between medical and scientific examiner, healer, and educator. But what does this mean for the subject or audience of the test? So those are kind of my framing questions. And as I said, we can discuss this more in the discussion section, and I'll pass off to Michele now.
Thank you, Sasha. Yeah, so I'll get back a little bit to introductions, even though Lucas has done a wonderful job. So I'm currently working as a postdoc in the chair for History and Philosophy of Medicine at Bielefeld University. But I also collaborate as a theater practitioner and teacher with different institutions, especially in the social and health sector. I see myself as moving in this strange space in between philosophy, science, medicine, and theater, which is often a confusing space, but also a very dynamic and fruitful one. So I have a background. I did my PhD dissertation in philosophy of science with a very classic work on how concepts change along the development of the history of science, and how this requires sometimes tackling problems of circularity. How do we make sure that the knowledge we produce is not just self-reinforcing itself, but it's really sticking to reality? And during my postdoc time, I worked in more interdisciplinary settings, especially with historians and sociologists of science, and I worked on topics related to measurement in the human sciences, and that's how Sasha and I started to collaborate. And I particularly focused on historical attempts to measure attributes of the human mind and experience through bodily parameters. I studied the history of chronological measurement, of the measurement of intelligence through the measurement of skulls, which connects to the history of intelligence tests, and on the history of the measurement of sensation in psychophysics. Here, in parallel to my academic work, I trained as a theater practitioner, especially with companies and artists that work in the constellation of traditions that are called social theater that is conceived as a social intervention, third theater that it's lived, that lives with the people who live outside of theater spaces, in hospitals, in schools, in prisons, and in community centers. And then the theater anthropology that focuses on local traditions of making theater rather than global. So in general, my theater activity is based on the practice of the theater laboratory, which is usually conceived as a shared space for participants to investigate themselves and specific philosophical, social, general issues that are tackled in an embodied way. So it's a space of exploration rather than a space for creating straight away a sort of performative output. And the pictures in the slides are taken for a couple of projects I did. One with an association that promotes palliative care in Italy, and the other with a sociocultural center in Switzerland. So in the rest of the few minutes I would like to briefly present three projects that I recently started, that are developing now, in which I'm experimenting with different ways of triangulating between theater, medicine, and philosophy. So this is a very complicated slide, but it worked well in my head. So the first project that I'm trying to develop is an attempt to apply performative methods and frameworks to a new part of research on measurement in the human sciences, and it's very close to in spirit to the work of Sasha in that sense. So the idea I had was to start exploring the connection between issues of measurement. How do we know what we're measuring? How do we make sure that we're measuring the attribute we want to measure and not something else? On the one hand. On the other hand, the body as a carrier of meaning, which is very relevant, especially when we want to measure hidden attributes, the attributes of the mind. And finally, the scientific attempt at representing exactly the human mind, especially in its individuality. So I thought of exploring this tripartite connection by focusing on a historical case and analyzing it through the lenses of performance. So during a recent workshop at University College London, where Sasha and I participated together, I proposed an attempt at reconstructing a historical experiment in psychological aesthetics. So I started from this research program that developed in Russia in the 1920s, a very obscure kind of research. I was interested in that because it involved dancers, art historians, and psychologists all together to try, on the one hand, to represent, to create a system of notation for movement, what you see to the left. They were trying to find a sort of grammar of how to represent bodily movement. But on the other, they were also trying to make experiments to sort of explain scientifically the correlation between psychic states, emotional states, and bodily postures. However, we do not have any written records of these experiments, no laboratory notes, nothing. So I decided to develop a fictional experiment. I created an experimental protocol that took inspiration from other activities of this research program, and of course the sort of the state of psychological knowledge at the time. And then I asked the participants at the workshop at UCL to take on in pairs the roles of experimenter and experimental subject, and to perform a sequence of movements and report on their emotional states through a sort of standardized questionnaire. And finally, I asked them questions about their experience of performing these experiments. So why I did that? So the aim of this was mostly exploratory. So you see two of the participants on the picture to the right. Because I wanted to start critically reflect from the experiences of the participants on a number of points. On one hand, the performativity intrinsic to these kinds, to an experiment of this kind, right? To use the body to investigate what is actually being lived and experienced by the subject. How the fact that these experiments have such a performative component can challenge the categories of standardization and replication. Also to understand how historically the role of the body as a mediator of meaning changes. And finally, the limits of doing such a counterfactual reenactment of an experiment that was never actually performed, or maybe it was, but we don't know about it. In the second project, I use performance instead of as an experimental framework, as a sort of theoretical framework to analyze patient simulations in healthcare and to understand what kind of knowledge they create. So in several countries and in Germany as well, medical students are trained with medical actors and are regularly evaluated based on these performances. These so-called patient simulations have become a widespread educational tool that provides medical trainees with hands-on experience without involving actual patients. So this is one of the benefits of this practice. And commentators have claimed that patient simulations benefit medical students because they using human simulators rather than mannequins or doing just a virtual training actually has the benefit of humanizing medical trainees because it exposes them to the care work of actual clinical practice, right? But in a safe setting without involving actual patients. However, there have also been critics to this practice because these critics have suggested that often these simulations are based on idealized scenarios that do not reflect how actually medical situations work in practice. And this can have an impact on the creativity and openness and other sort of important aspects of the medical training. For instance, by producing certain stereotyping effects. These critical perspectives have scarcely engaged with one specific aspect, which is what kind of knowledge do these patient simulations produce? So in the project I have on this, I try to regard these simulations as a specific form of experimental practice rather than just a learning activity. A sort of laboratory practice in which medical students experiment with the relational aspects of clinical practice. So in the perspective I'm trying to develop, these simulations are not just providing medical students with technical, clinical, and communication skills, but they should also sort of invite them to explore themselves in the context of the clinical relationship. So they do not just gain practical knowledge, but they also gain experiential knowledge about their medical and personal selves by trying out different things, different ways of relating themselves to the other. And I think that this perspective has also other philosophical implications concerning, for instance, the reduction of these possible stereotyping effects and avoiding certain issues that can be connected, such as issues of testimonial injustice, for instance, not really listening what the patient has to say based on certain assumptions about their social identity, for example, which is quite a topic in philosophy of medicine. And I thought it was very funny that this AI-generated image took me a lot of time to make it happen with a human patient, because as soon as I was discussing patient simulations, I was keeping on getting mannequins, and I had to convince ChatGPT that I wanted a real human. Finally, to conclude, following up both on this initial work on patient simulations and on our recent shared work at teaching performing science and medicine, I have a third project that wants to develop performance-based teaching methods for both philosophy and the medical humanities. So this is, on the one hand, relying on already established performative practices, such as the one of patient simulations, but trying to sort of rely on these already existing practices to introduce philosophical debates that are relevant for the training of medical students, for instance, on theories of illness and disease, or the role of patients in the experience of being a medical practitioner. But rather than introducing them as a theoretical sort of topic to be discussed in a classroom setting, I think that it's important to use learning practices that are already established in an experiential way. So within the act of doing a patient simulation, these topics can be brought in and then discussed at the later stage. On the other hand, I'm also thinking about how to develop new teaching methods that are performance-based. They could be relevant to the medical humanities. Again, going experiential rather than the intellectual way to bring philosophical discussions in. At the moment, I'm training with artists that work in a specific tradition of theater. It's called sensory theater. that was developed by a Colombian anthropologist, Enrique Vargas, that starts from the sensory experience, the smells, the auditory sensations, and the visual sensations to, through the lived experience, bring in sort of philosophical discussions as a topic of training. So my aim is to create learning tools that are inspired by these experiential practices. Yeah, this is it, and we're very much looking forward to our discussion with Lucas and to your questions.
Thank you so much. And while you were speaking and I was looking around, I just realized it couldn't be a better place to talk about performative approaches. We are in a what you call an operating theater. No, this is like the theater within the medical context where surgical demonstration were done or anatomical dissections were happening in this operating theater, like an amphitheater like this. And they are actually in a way a combination of a teaching space for the medical students, historically speaking, but they were also a public spectacle because we're also for paying audiences. They could kind of be present while a surgery was happening. So this is a pure coincidence, but it seems to be very well fitting. Yeah, I have so many notes. I took so many notes while you guys were speaking. It's hard to decide with which questions I opened, but maybe we can start with a topic that reoccurred quite a bit and was a topic also in actually last week's discussion when Hannah Strohmeyer and Danny Miller were here, and it was also mentioned in the reflections, and that's of like academic conventions. And you both represent a practice-based research approach and an embodied knowledge approach. Now it's a tricky one to navigate the line between the artistic expression, whether it's in theater or in artistic practice, and academic inquiry, and you do both. You spoke a lot about measurements, examinations, about categories, about questionnaires. No, that's kind of a common denominator, the measuring part that you both share in your scientific work in particular. Now, my question is, what forms of evidence or validation matter most in your work? And to whom? So you operate across very different fields, theater and science and art practice. And both of these fields have their very own criteria for what kind of counts as real or valuable. So how do you negotiate this, what's the word, legitimacy across these contexts? It's a very long question, but it's also a simple one. How do you navigate this?
Shall I start? Okay. It's a very challenging question. But my initial reaction is to this word validation you used, right? Because that's actually how we met. We were part of a research group on practices of validation in the biomedical sciences, which was actually the object of our general inquiry, right? What does it mean that a test is valid? What does it mean that a measurement scale is a valid one, right? So this was the starting point, at least for me and for other people in this group. But then the question can be turned against us, right? So how, as historians, philosophers, social science scholars, what does it mean that the knowledge we produce is valid, right? What are the standards? I mean, it's a subtle line to navigate, especially when the practice-based and artistic research enters the room, right? Because then, especially in this case, I mean, I speak for myself, but I don't feel that there are standard rules in this game, right? Already in the humanities, the validity of the results is, I mean, I don't want to make a reductionist claim, but it's very much tied to the standards of the communities that enact them, right? So it's a matter of how the people conceive the standards about their own work, right? And of course, this brings a whole lot about power dynamics on the table.
Yeah, I think you bring something that was a huge difficulty that I'm still encountering, which is, at least for me, bringing three areas together into conversation, being artistic practice, humanities research, and medical sciences in a broadly understood. And I think I've was only so far in some ways able to tackle the difficulties between actually the arts practice and the humanities research, where my topic was the third area, but my research wasn't so much yet in conversation, for example, with psychological practitioners. So I was really using historical materials, especially the test kits themselves, and kind of working almost hermeneutically with them, looking at what did they have to say, their design, the instructions, and looking at historical materials. And I'm looking forward to kind of the next stages of both that project and future projects to think about actually working with people who are knowledgeable about the practices, and sort of I've had anecdotal, obviously conversations with psychologists and special education students who work in testing, but I've not been able to sort of engage that area because I think, as Michele was kind of saying, the parameters already for what is humanities research and what are the standards of that was already something very difficult to bring together with the artistic research. But I think it speaks to the kind of interesting complication that you're staging here and that we're hoping to continue staging, which is actually bringing these three things together, which I hope we can successfully do.
And speaking of quote unquote interesting complications, I think it is said. But then beyond the question of validation across these two different contexts, or three, whatever, how many different contexts, but how do they, in your personal practice, inform one another or challenge and negotiate? You spoke earlier how, or at the end, you made points of how you try to bring performative aspects into the teaching and vice versa. So how does kind of, let's see, your performative theoretical backdrop kind of inform your research in the science of philosophy, etc., and vice versa?
I can start, even though you had a practical example. I mean, actually, some of the difficulties were that I felt that at least the areas of art that I came from were already very good partners for doing the kind of humanities, psychosocial research that I was doing. I felt like, as Michele was talking about in the sort of introduction, there is all of this literature on reenactment and performance, but not much usually gets actually done. And so I felt like these, the marriage between these was already kind of ready to go. And same goes for, I mean, it's sort of outside of the scope of what we were presenting, but also looking at the aesthetics through artistic methods, photography, installation, et cetera, were already at hand. And so in some ways it kind of, it's not that it hasn't been difficult to bring these projects into practice. And sometimes I think I get worried about losing some of the freedom of the artistic work that I would do without all of the kinds of background research that I have to do and be very careful about in a different kind of context of an academic context. But they also did feel already ready for each other. So I felt kind of a natural, I mean, there's a lot for me to still learn, not coming from an academic background, but I felt a sort of natural fit, especially in history and philosophy of science, STS as well, to practice maybe.
Yeah, I think I had a much more convoluted relationship with these two dimensions of my work. Because I think I started with a very traditional philosophy of science approach that's very theoretical, very abstract, and then increasingly, but in the beginning I was focusing on experimental physics, which is something that's it's hard to envision how it connects with performance. So for me, it was just two separate words for a lot of time, and especially the kind of theater practice that I was doing was very far from anything intellectual. So it was really about being with people and learning with them how to make things with the body and sort of use some develop some symbolic vision about emotions and sort of make something concrete out of what was still unshaped within. And then increasingly I started merging the things. Of course, important meetings have helped this unfold. But yeah, it was a longer story, I think, to make them in connection.
Expand, please.
Yeah. I think I'm still figuring that out. This is the answer, I would say. I think that, yes, the sort of connection I find is on a very general level. So I then became, in my philosophical research, much more interested in the topic of measurement, especially the fact that how do we measure these attributes that we do not see, we do not have access to, especially when this is done by using something that we can actually see, for instance, the body, to measure the mind, right? And I saw, so I sort of, the connection that I found for myself to keep struggling with connecting artistic practice and philosophical research on science and medicine was, okay, what happens with theater is not something very much different. We are trying to give shape to something that's relates to the inner life, right? To the sensations and emotions and all this that happens within. And it's just a very different way of giving shape to something through body and voice and a sequence of movements in space, right? So it's making something concrete out of the abstract. So at this moment, my connection is at this very general level, but I think there are so many ways that this can be combined in practice, and we're just experimenting on very few of them.
Speaking of combination in practice and sequence of bodies and movement, we started this ritual that about halfway through you have to find a new position. So, I'm not kidding. So I'll ask you to get up and find a new position here in the room.
Very nice.
This was a perfect cue that you gave me.
To break the habits.
To break the habits, to have a more embodied practice. It was actually a proposal by one of the listeners in the second session. So I will have one more question for them, and then it's you guys. And although guys, everyone up there, come closer. Makes the whole thing easier. Have you all settled in? Good. Okay, so another question that came about when you spoke about the performative aspect of medicine, also of medical science, and actually also the image that you showed, the AI rendered image. And that's a topic that we had here as well in previous discussion. What kind of roles do doctors, patients, and researchers play? And what happens from your experience when we shift or subvert them? They were also part of your film that you showed us, no?
Wow. What happens when we subvert them? I think that a lot of...
First of all, what roles do they play? And then what happens once we subvert them?
Do you have anything on what role they play? Well, go ahead then.
Uh-oh. I accepted the microphone. Now I've sort of blanked on what I was going to say. Yeah, I mean, I think I can speak first sort of the experience of doing this video, which is, again, not actually working with medical practitioners, but working with actors. But one thing that was very interesting is that that I found very interesting was that I gave very little direction as to what the actors particularly should bring to wear. And how they should sort of be. I gave them information about the test, to whom it might be performed, yeah, sort of coached them through some of the particulars of the timing of the tests. But they came with their own personas of what a psychologist or psychometrician would be, which I thought was very interesting. Again, this is from the other side, what's imagined of a medical practitioner or a psychologist specifically here. But I think it says something about what they've encountered, both personally and through sort of media. And in terms of subversion, I think I sort of watched some of it happen there, which anecdotally happens in other places too. And Lewis, who ends up being sort of the star of the video very often, the gentleman with the gray beard. And I don't know if you've noticed, but he took his shoes off and wouldn't do it without his shoes. So there are these sort of moments of breaks in professionalism, I think, that were kind of enacted there, but I think that they happen in practice too. So, but it was interesting to me to see what kind of got crafted by non-medical practitioners about what they think of as the sort of acting as the profession. And this happened very differently across the multiple 8 people who took this role very seriously. That they were in different stages of acting, but all in acting training or professional actors. I hope that helps.
Yeah, I think this is an interesting starting point, because it makes me think about the fact that this stereotyping that I was mentioning before, it's not just something that's unidirectional, right? It's not just doctors or healthcare practitioners stereotyping patients in some ways, but there is also the reverse direction, right? We tend to stereotype medical and healthcare practitioners in certain ways by certain parameters, and then this gets reproduced. I'm thinking about the fact that often medical students that are doing this training with patient simulations are and maybe have questions about how to tackle this, because there is a performative component, and maybe they feel a little awkward or uncomfortable with that, and they're often told to be themselves. Oh, just be yourself, and you'll do fine. You'll find your way of being a doctor, which on surface seems to be a very very reasonable comment, a very sort of liberating comment. But on the other hand, it's also very, you might get lost in trying to find yourself in that kind of relationship, right? It's not easy to be yourself in something very structured and influenced by the social stereotypes about how it is to be a doctor, right? So I think that these little acts of subversion that can be done also through research and through artistic practice can also break a little bit these mechanisms of taking for granted that, well, just go and be yourself, you'll be a wonderful doctor.
Oh, great. Now all the hands. So I have one here, but there's 3 more coming. I just wanted, you have such beautiful formulations today. Acts of subversion. In a way, this whole semester has been a beautiful act of subversion here at the Charité, of the people that we brought here on stage and the topics that we discussed within the context that we come from. But first question from the audience.
Thank you so much. It's a really interesting intersection you work in. I think we're introducing ourselves, right? Yeah. So I'm Roya. I'm a design student, and I work on design in the medical field in my bachelor's project at the moment. Yeah, and I wondered, is there an experience or different maybe multiple stories that really changed your perspective on like academia? Oh, sorry, like this, yeah. Is there, did you have experiences that like fundamentally changed your perspective on research or on also the like academia, also the performance arts, maybe that you experienced or you observed and that really shaped your view on it? Yeah.
It's a good question, and I don't have a good answer, except to say that I found it difficult from the moment I started through now. And part of that is feeling a responsibility to tackle so many different things at once, and sort of by being interested in so many different both methods and also topics, feeling very overwhelmed, and finding that sort of focusing in even very difficult, but also sort of the suspicion kind of coming from within. So I don't really have like I guess the transformation hasn't happened yet, but I think sometimes trying to take one thing at a time and understanding, for me, this is sort of part of a long process. And sometimes when I look back, I think, oh, wow, how much has changed in a few years in terms of my own thought processes, et cetera. So even as I'm sitting here, I'm thinking, I really want to do more work, for example, with people who, as I said, I spoke with people who administer these tests today, but I haven't used that in my research, and I'm already starting to get off. So I think it's sort of allowing yourself or allowing myself the time to kind of do things a step at a time is maybe the bit of transformation. Or
Yeah, I totally agree with this politics of small steps, which is often, very hard to allow yourself to do, because then it's all about what is the output, right? And but I think that in this context, even small moments can have a transformative effect in some sense, if we want to use that word. I was mentioning this workshop at UCL where both Sasha and I went. It was called, I think, Experimental History of Science, something like that. And it was, I think, a very nice attempt to really break the sort of the standard non-small steps kind of research that is done in academia in that sense, trying to leave an open space for experimentation. Most of the people brought in combinations of artistic practice and research. From my perspective, the sort of the experiment that I did, and having a bunch of academics doing strange movements with the other taking notes on a sheet of paper, and seeing just the bodies change and the sort of the relationship within them, among them, to be not the usual ones, like as we're standing now, sitting and in face to face, right? It was just a little moment of yeah, there's still freedom.
Thank you. Before I pass the mic again, this makes me think, you mentioned the small steps that already make a big difference. There is, by the late Virgil Abloh, the 3% rule. He's a designer, and he said it's actually enough to do a 3% change of an existing design to create an incremental change that can have a transformative aspect. So it's something nice to keep in mind. You don't have to change everything or change the whole plot. Sometimes 3% is enough for a transformation.
Hello, hi, I'm Julia. I'm a medical student and also an actress. So this was perfect for me, and it has been evoking a lot of thoughts and also feelings in me, because I have some really burning questions. And I'm very interested in the trainings you are developing for medical students, because obviously I've done a couple of them. And not only during my studies, but also now in my practical year, when I see the discussions like within with doctors, but also with patients, I'm missing two things. And that's for me critical thinking, and also not only empathy, but communication and connection. I don't know, I don't want to be too critical, but I have a little bit the feeling I'm encouraged to think in stereotypes, and I'm encouraged to not ask too many questions. And I find that really difficult, especially if I have a patient with a very complex history from a different cultural background, maybe different gender identities. So these are complex fields, and sometimes I'm shocked a little bit on what level we are discussing. I don't know, coming from the humanities, for me, it's just very natural to ask a lot of questions and to create a safe space to do so. And yeah, I didn't have the feeling so far that people like that so much. So I wondered about the formats you're creating, and if maybe those are also things you have experienced.
Thank you so much. I don't know where to start, because all you say is very inspiring, and I think I should also talk more with people like you who are going through this training with a critical perspective, but also people who go through the training without having the chance to develop a critical perspective. I think the points you make are absolutely important. Of course, they struggle with the elements about the medical training and the healthcare system that provide constraints, right? Once you have an 8-minute slot to see a patient, there's only so much you can do to apply critical thinking and empathy, right, in that sense. So these are matter of facts that we probably don't have much we can do about. But I think it is very important to open a room, at least during the moment of training, right? To sort of keep that in mind. I'm thinking two things now. The fact that this is very anecdotal in my personal experience with friends who are doctors. They go through a training of being medical doctors. It goes fast and it's tough. And then they start being practitioners. And then when they hit their mid-30s, they start asking these questions, because they start feeling that there is something wrong on some level of the way they've been trained to, but for necessary reasons to cope with the constraints they're accustomed. So sometimes I also think maybe these aspects of the training should come later in the life of, because in the beginning, there's also in philosophy of science, especially, there's always this common thread, right? That, well, of course, scientists need philosophers, because philosophers ask all the questions that scientists do not have time and actually energy to ask, right? But maybe that's also the case with doctors, right? Or maybe not, because maybe they don't have the time to have that critical perspective, to have that sort of more space for empathy, and therefore someone else should do that for them. Who knows? I think that it shouldn't be the same as in science. There's a completely different things at stake, but the question is a difficult one to answer.
But a beautiful one too, before I pass on, another, my 2 cents to it, is that I think, I mean, that's the whole reason why we're doing this here. No? That's why we're trying to create a platform for a transdisciplinary way of learning together as well. And it's also something that kind of reacts to the reality that we live in today and the future that we're facing. And there's this concept, maybe you came across it, it's within the educational field, of the so-called future skills. Like, what kind of skills do we need to make it in the future? Because the systems that we have grown up in and that we've been educated are kind of old systems. And they usually mention the 4 C's, and that's creativity, that's critical thinking, that's communication, you mentioned almost all of them, and collaboration. I like to add a fifth C, which is care, which you also mentioned with empathy. But these are kind of, let's say, the 5 Cs of future skills. And I think that helps me always as a way of looking at the world, also looking at the practice that we do. And now to your question.
Thank you very much for presenting your very interesting intersection of medicine and arts and actually research as well. I don't know if this is a question. Oh, yeah, sorry. Natalie, I study art education in the UDK and am interested really by interdisciplinary knowledge, everything. And I was really interested by what you said, Michele. At some point you said, you asked yourself, how do we make sure knowledge we reproduce is not just self-reproducing, but actually remains true to reality? That's how I'm rephrasing it for myself. And then how that fits with, let's say, the practice of using actors who, from what I gather from the description, have not gone to observe reality of a doctor practicing to inform their acting, which is part of a method actors can do to actually go and observe reality. I find that quite interesting because then I ask myself, okay, so what kind of knowledge am I reproducing in this context if I'm not requiring, let's say, my actors to go and observe reality, or if I'm not requiring my students to go and observe actual doctors practicing so they have an idea and they can position themselves how they might want to be doctors, because it is, of course, it's a kind of performance. And in teaching, we do that. We go and observe teachers and we are told explicitly, how do you want to be, yeah? How do you want to be a teacher? So yeah, those are thoughts. It's not exactly a question, but I thought I'd share that.
Yeah, thanks. They're very, very interesting thoughts. I don't know if I have an answer. I think that it all. I think that the topic of reproducibility is a very important one here, right? And how does art reproduce? On the other hand, how does science reproduce and represent, right? There are for sure a lot of differences, but perhaps also some similarities, right? And I think that, I mean, the problem of stereotyping is maybe not even a problem sometimes, right? In a lot of acting training is based on actually learning to embody certain human stereotypes, right? You start the masks, the commedia dell'arte, right? It's all about learning how to embody a certain stereotype, which gives you a cage from which you can actually find something specific and unique, right? But without that cage, you're a little lost. It can really be anything, and then anything is nothing, right? Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. There is a strong tradition of that, and it's absolutely an interesting and informative one. Yeah. Do you want to add something?
Hi, I'm Lucas. I'm a physician from Colombia, and I work in a hospital here in Berlin. And hearing you, I was always thinking about three things that are present in my life. Like I feel like we have like the science, and also an artist that is performing, but also an artisan, because the science that I know that exists is something that is somehow far away. It's more like the practice and the everyday repeating that is at the end of the day, like taking the control behind the artist. And when I saw your videos, I was thinking about, okay, they are these actors, they are taking this role, but they are putting all of us in a role as a patient or examined. And you mentioned a lot of, okay, reproducibility and how do we measure that. And now I have a question for you that you're studying this field. do you feel like there is a tension between the science and the control that we feel that we get over the reality through science, and the spontaneity and the artistic way in which we live? Do you feel like there are things from the science that are like making an exigence from those that are performing, like, hey, do this standardized so that you feel that you have control in this situation? Do you feel like these kind of trainings are taking away this uncertainty of my everyday performing as a doctor?
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, I think that rivers of ink have been spilled on these questions, right? How on power and control with respect to science, right? What is the and medicine, of course. It's a very difficult question to answer. I think that there are a lot of nuances to be disentangled from the question you ask, right? Because first of all, what is the domain of science and the domain of art, right? What goals do they have? And maybe it's always better to talk about the people, right? What are the goals of scientists? What are the goals of artists? What are the goals of the people who pay artists and pay scientists, right? So I think that, I mean, to go really Foucauldian, power can be anywhere, right? And can be sort of guiding the goals and the strategies that are enacted by all these actors somehow. But it's, I think it's very difficult to make a general comment on these dynamics, right? I don't know, Sasha, do you want to?
Some anecdotal, again, like this wasn't part of my research. It's not something I didn't do interviews with psychologists, but I do know some people who do testing and who also use contemporary versions of these kinds of things in their offices. And if they don't need to produce a score at the end, I've actually heard of much creative use of these tests. So I think that they're and this is particularly in a private practice setting. I think that there is some rebellion that happens. Some of the training was potentially useful, and some things get thrown out the window. So when you think, when you were saying sort of, are some of these things restrictive? I think I can say anecdotally, some people think so, yes. And I mean, aside from a lot of people not wanting to use psychometric tests like this at all in practice, some people have found sort of their own creative approaches to looking for something else, and maybe a sort of side an aside also in terms of what you were talking about. I mean, I think both of our interests in the human sciences and the sort of objects. So for me in this intelligence has irked me to no end of kind of what the attempts at defining what this human trait are. And I want to have a belief that there is no such thing as intelligence actually, but that this is such a slippery and undefinable human trait that to sort of standardize an approach to actually measuring it or having even a stable concept there is not possible. So I think in some ways this kind of touches upon your kind of unruly, your question about sort of unruly human emotions, desires, etc. Maybe that gets to it. I hope we answered your question, kind of.
Hi, my name is Vera. I don't really have a question for you guys, but I'm coming from the field of fashion design, and I started to make an education, MTR, Medical Technology of Radiology, here in Berlin with my age, so quite late. So I'm also coming from the yoga background, And my experience in the medical field actually is not so good, because it's very categorizing the people which are sick. And I think I'm quite an emotional and empathetic person, and I try to maybe change the system within, but there is no time and there's no place for me and for this field. To have people here who try to make it different, or to take the people from where they are standing, not to see them with the eyes of a medicine person and who's easy in categorizing, like this is sick, this is old, this is young. And I think it's quite hard to change it, to go there with a different point of view. At least for me, I made this experience. And yeah, so.
Thank you. I mean, I can make a question out of this. Thank you, Vera, no, for sharing. This has been resonating quite often here before in the previous conversations that we had, this kind of sentiment or feeling. But maybe this connects to the very beginning, Michele, when you spoke about like where the overlaps are between the philosophy of science and medical sciences and actually medicine. And you called the nature of health. That's what you said. That's a big topic. Now understanding what is actually healthy, what is unhealthy, what do we deem healthy or unhealthy or worth, etc. So what has been your learning on that topic, or what are the different concepts of health that you've come across as a philosopher of medical science?
Well,
no pressure.
Well, so one thing I think it's fair to say is that these concepts change over time, right? Theories of health and disease change over time. And a lot of the knowledge that we have on what is, as you said, Lucas, what is healthy, changes over time too, right? So there is this also can create long-standing issues of trust, right? I mean, you told us that drinking a glass of wine per meal was healthy 5 years ago, and now it seems that it's, the worst thing you can do to your body. So how then can we trust anything that comes out of this? I mean, it's something that comes up even in, just regular conversations. But the topic there is what is health in general, right? Rather than what is this actual thing that we deem healthy or not. And the problem is that also what we mean by health has changed a lot over time. I mean, we have a colleague in Bielefeld who works on the topic of skincare, right? I'm just taking this as an example, but what counts as a healthy skin varies massively depending on geographical context and historical time, and whether at all. I mean, I think that even in Germany, there was a big distinction in the training of people who were in skin healthcare. In East Germany, there were trained medical professionals, and in Western Germany, they just had, I think, a few months training to work as people dispensing skin knowledge, right? And I think that makes it for the case of what is health and what is disease. Well, this is a very loaded question, because this is very context dependent. And this speaks for the fact that we often have to agree with what we think is healthy or not. And then, of course, then the nature of medical knowledge is much more than that. Skin knowledge is very different from knowledge about cancer, for instance, given the state of knowledge we're at. But context and history often transform our concepts over time. And this is really important to take into consideration.
Sorry, before I pass on, and also very different in cultural context, no? Of like whether you understand it of something that needs to be healed or not healed. So I think this is a huge topic that kind of continues to reoccur here.
I just have a question to your work. Also, I'm Caro from Potsdam and the founder of the Living Museum there. So I also combine arts and mental health, also especially mental health. And I want to ask if the doctors in the training with the role play, if they change roles, also if they are also in the role of the client or of the patient. Yeah, so.
You mean if the medical students also?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's different ways of going about this training, and very often the medical students also work with one another, right? One performs the doctor and the other performs the patient. So they also are put in the position of being patients, right? Yeah.
Yeah, but one more question. It's not a follow-up question of my last one, but it's also a bit more meta. I just wonder, because I think almost everyone in this room and you too, you work in so many different fields, work in different fields and different projects. Do you have any advice on how to navigate that within your career of being interested in different topics and being so curious about different things when, especially, I think academia, maybe more than the arts, is not very accommodating for people like that? Yeah, do you have any, like, maybe also practical advice or any learnings?
It's not easy to do at first, but I think one of the things that has been the most useful for me is finding community just outside of the sort of traditional academic sphere. So even if you're kind of endeavoring to do academic work, that, for example, the working group that we have, there's a lot of room to also discuss the difficulties, to share some helpful context for, or tips for each other, which journals are maybe accommodating to unusual formats. It takes a lot of work, though, and this is what sort of sometimes feels unfair because here and other academic contexts I've been in, there seems to be a lot of actual interest in artistic research coming together with academic research, and then the structure doesn't actually really, it's not completely there. So that's something I'm still sort of struggling with, because it means a lot of kind of extra work in the margins. But some of the extra work is really nourishing and quite helpful in getting through those steps. So that would be my my main thing is finding some other people and just doing things on the side. It's unpaid labor, though, so, and I don't like to suggest that for anyone, but there's sometimes grant money, but it's usually volunteer work for oneself, I guess. I hope that helps a little bit. I'm happy to chat after.
Yeah, I'm Yasmin and I'm a medical student, and I have a question to something you pointed out earlier during this discussion, questioning if intelligence even exists. Because during an internship where I worked for a doctor who was a pediatric, there was a girl who was going to school. She was like in 3rd grade, and she had a lower IQ after testing. And she was struggling the whole time, her and her mother, because it became more and more difficult for her to keep up with the other kids, and there was no explanation. So the moment the IQ thing came up, it was okay, we can just, nobody's doing anything wrong, we can take the pressure out, and it's just like a physical limitation for her. There's a point where you can't push her anymore. So I believe it does exist somehow. Just saying it doesn't exist wouldn't help her, or just saying, well, she has a different kind of intelligence. I do believe there are different kinds of intelligences, but in this case, she has a problem, and we need a tool to have a diagnosis for it.
Yeah, I thank you for that's a very good point, and I was kind of lazy with my with my claim before, but sort of actually in line with what your comment was. I think the loadedness of the categories is some of the problem, and part of the problem is taking this large concept of intelligence and saying that there's a test to test for specifically this thing, whereas there's absolutely the lived experience of difficulty, of disability, etc. And I think for me, it's claiming a concept that we're using in everyday parlance, intelligence. There's artificial intelligence. These animals are more intelligent than others. And we're using this shifting term that's incredibly loaded. So I'm not against medical testing and the uses of these devices. I'm not against, obviously, sort of the sort of the understanding of an individual and what may or may not help them. So as I said, it was kind of a lazy statement of saying intelligence, but I think this is kind of a huge part of Michele's work as well, and also other historians of and philosophers of science that sort of question taking these sort of folk concepts, things from outside in the world, and claiming that we can have scientific knowledge of them, where actually it's much easier to be very, very specific about the tests for these specific, the test for what it tests for, and we find this useful in sort of understanding an individual's abilities, but not kind of giving the umbrella concept of intelligence. So I hope that's helpful.
Do you want to add something to this as an expert of intelligence measurements? Are you sure? Yeah. Well, then I would say we come to an end of the semester and of this very last session of the Healing Arts, and give our two guest speakers here a warm applause. Thank you, Sasha. Thank you, Michele. Thank you, Anna, for making this happen. Thank you, Vanessa. Thank you, Jakob. And thank all of you for coming here and kind of making this actually what it is. And if you are here not for the very first time, you know the one rule before leaving the room is that you turn around. Maybe you're sitting to someone that you came with. So say hi to someone that you don't know and make that person a compliment, please. Thank you very much for being here.